She holds a master's degree in documentary from Columbia University, and her feature debut, Gun Runners, premiered at the Hot Docs Film Festival in 2016. Her new film here, in collaboration with co-director Hawa Esman, is called Silas. It had the world premiere last night about the Liberian activist Silas Siakor. And she comes today to talk about dialogues concerning how to navigate cultural appropriation, the White Saviour Industrial Complex, the need to expand support for films beyond those focusing on social justice, the uses of technology, including some technology that Nayar has developed herself, and the need to bring new voices to the table. And she's also going to provide some practical strategies for action. It's what it says in 15 minutes. Here she is, Anjali Nayar.
Hi, everyone. I should start by saying that I don't have all the answers. So instead of kind of sharing any kind of words of wisdom, I wanted to really start the conversation about something that I question in my own filmmaking, and something that I feel that we increasingly must be all talking about, not only as storytellers, but those of us in the room who, enable these stories to go out to the world. And that is, whose stories do we have the right to tell? And in telling those stories, I don't think this works. So, sorry guys. There won't be any, oh, there you go. Sorry about that. We might not be able to go backwards. Whose stories do we have the right to tell? And, in doing that, how do we do them justice? So there are a lot of terms circling around right now, and, some of them are cultural appropriation, the White Saviour Industrial Complex, voyeurism, and more. A quick Google of these terms, will get us more definitions and discussions than we can imagine. And I don't think that there's a real easy answer in getting it right. It's become quite standard, I suppose, in this discussion to so-called check in one's privilege. And I'll do this not only to tell you where I'm coming from, but also to paint a picture of why I think that that question of whose stories do we have a right to tell is so complicated for me and probably for all of us. So I'm a woman, I'm biracial. I come from an Indian immigrant family. I have 3 moms, 2 of whom are gay and are in the audience right now. But I'm also, cis, heterosexual, middle class. My parents worked really hard to provide us with an incredible upbringing that was comfortable and a great education. So I have privilege, as do most of us sitting in this room. And we're often telling stories of people who sometimes don't have as much privilege as we do. So this is my first film at Tiff, as Tom said, and we're really excited. Our world premiere was last night. It was a film called Silas, which is about a generation of young Liberians, environmental activists, who are using technology to speak truth to power and hold their government accountable. So do I have a right to tell this story? I'm not young, I'm not Liberian, I'm not part of this movement. And on paper, based on the shade of my skin, based on my faith, based on my gender, I might be the next in line to be the director of a documentary on Lily Singh, or the other incredible artists that are coming out of Brampton, Ontario, and other Toronto suburbs. But what if I told you that I moved away from Montreal, my hometown, Eastern Canada, when I was 18 years old? That I'm unfortunately almost completely disconnected with my Indian roots? What if I told you that I've lived the entire last 10 years, more than a decade actually, my whole post-education life in Kenya, that it's my home, it's where my community is? What if I told you that my background is in environmental science, that in climate change, that I've collaborated with the group that's featured in the film for over the last 10 years? It's not easy. Do I have a right to tell this story? Some will say no, it's never okay. And I think there's another person of mixed heritage that I've been reading recently, and that I think that also feels this confusion. And it's Zadie Smith, and she wrote an editorial called "Who Owns Black Pain?" I might point out that she got a lot of flack, should I say, for writing this. And she turned to her children in the article and she said, you know, their beloved father is white, and I'm biracial. They are quadroons. Could they take black suffering as the subject of their art? They themselves are sort of yellowy. When exactly does black suffering cease to be their concern? Lobotomies are the cleanest cut, but life is messier. There's no getting out of our intertwined history. There's truth to the fact that narratives have been framed throughout history by those of us with different levels of privilege, and that we might need to learn how to step aside and make space for the other side of a story. We've all seen the films, let's talk about environmental films, because that's what mine is, but of Americans who missioned to save dolphins from Japanese fishermen, or the white people venturing to Africa to save elephants or gorillas or any other number of charismatic megafauna. There's probably an entire section on Netflix right now that's called White Saviors. But when I wanted to make this film, like on Liberia, you know, featuring this world-renowned activist, you know, the first producer I spoke to said, I should be the subject of this story. This is about me as an environmental scientist, and I'm going to be the bridge to help people understand what Liberians are facing. You know, when I tried to find funding for this film, I was constantly fighting the dominant narrative of the president of the country, who happens to be Harvard educated, who worked for the UN and the World Bank, who's a Nobel laureate. But what about the people on the ground? So there's literally so many stories that say how Ellen Johnson Sirleaf rescued Liberia. So what about the millions of people on the ground in Liberia who have a profoundly different experience and perspective of how the country is being run? Whose stories do we have the right to tell? This is actually a book that came out of the lobbyist for Ellen that has served as her advisor about choosing the hero. So, who chooses our heroes? Again, I might say I don't have the answers. And when I was picking a story like this one in Liberia, when I fell in love with this idea of telling this story, which is incredibly nuanced, which involves so much history and background in a society in which I am considered other, there are a few things that I really had to think strongly about. I really had to dig deep. The first, I think, is really knowing when to shut up. And in choosing and deciding not to be the main character of the film, in making our main character this incredible Liberian activist who was driving the story and allowing his team to be the focus, was the first start. The second thing I learned from a vapor lounge just down the street, from a Tribe Called Red just about a week ago, is this slogan, kind of nothing about us without us. So films are collaborations of ideas and so on. We shouldn't be stepping into them with any kind of preconceived notions about what the real story is. And part of that is making sure that communities and people that we're working with are part of this storytelling process. What we did in Liberia, you know, when you walk in and you're talking about foreign corporations and government and so on, and you walk into a tiny little community, first of all, you're never going to be there, but secondly, nothing's really going to happen while you're there anyway. So in order to kind of allow people to decide what was important and capture what was important and bring it to the awareness of the international community, it was really about using what was in everybody's hands and democratizing the process of documenting and storytelling. So in Liberia, as pretty much everywhere around the world, smartphones are everywhere, tablets are everywhere. You walk into a community and everybody is recording. So what we did in our film was we created an app called Timby, or This Is My Backyard, where we could actually have people use their smartphone to document and add reports of what they thought were important. And so those are the things that made it into the actual film and helped determine the narrative. So the next thing I should say is that, you know, as I mentioned, we can't come in with preconceived notions. We can't come in and think that we have all the answers. We have to be, in fact, open to the fact that we will make mistakes, that, you know, that just about having empathy is not enough. And be okay with those mistakes. And I would probably point out mistakes maybe that I have made in my own filmmaking. As much as I might have tried to tell the story as honestly as I could, people in watching the film have come back to me with two different points. And the first of which is during the backstory of the Liberian War in my film, Silas, they pointed out, okay, why did you have to go and fall into the same tropes of talking about another African war story? In fact, my character is motivated by what happened during the Civil War in Liberia. And so for about 14 seconds in the film, there is pictures of what he went through and the things that his entire kind of community, what motivated them to step up and make a difference. Now, on one hand, I could say, well, that was actually the story of my main character, and it was an important plot point or narrative point. On the other hand, I also have to realize that perhaps I made a mistake, and perhaps I should think differently about how I portray the past. The second thing that people have pointed out is there's a section in the film where my main character talks about how he feels about how he grew up and how he loved the countryside, and it was entirely idyllic. And in that section, there's this one frame, which somebody pointed at and said, this is exoticism, this is voyeurism, this is National Geographic. How could you possibly put that into the film? So there were, again, narrative reasons why I did it. There were narrative reasons why I thought it was important to paint this so-called idyllic picture, but maybe that was what my perception of an idyllic picture was, with a whole bunch of kids enjoying eating fruits and so on. Maybe that was my own bias, and I have to be aware of it. So it's not to say that we can't make mistakes, but we have to be able to take the criticism for them. I suppose the last thing that I would really like to talk about is not only what as we as filmmakers need to do, but also as an entire community. How do we provide space for not only these tropes, how do we provide space for the different narratives? And one of the things that I think comes so strongly from the Global South is that most of the funding that's provided or available to films from the Global South, whether you are a North American or somebody that's from the Global South, is for social justice films. And in itself, that I don't think that that's a bad thing, but it also frames and puts a frame on kind of what types of stories we get from there in an international community such as Toronto. So most of the films that you'll see, you can apply to a number of foundations to get funding for, but for something that's frivolous, for something that's fun, there's really hardly any options. So in making a couple films at the same time, I had this film, Silas, which was a great activist film, and I also had another film called Just a Band about 4 middle-class boys that create an Afro-electric pop group that wants to go to space. But finding funding for it wasn't necessarily the easiest. So it's still on the table. But how do we start including those stories, and how do they help us all understand, whether we are filmmakers from the region or not, how do we make it possible to tell these stories? So in kind of closing, I'd love to quote another good friend who has written a lot on this subject, Teju Cole. And in talking about some of these issues that are especially going on in America, but we equally face them here in Canada, he says, we have a responsibility to tell one another's stories, and we must be free to do so. But it has to be done with imagination and skepticism. It might require us not to give up our freedom, but to prioritize justice over freedom. So I just call in Tom Powers, and maybe we can have a further chat. Hopefully this leads to discussion. Again, I don't know all the answers, but I'm hoping that having this conversation will be helpful to us all.
So we can bring up the lights and make this an interactive conversation for the 10 minutes or so we have. I'd welcome anyone who wants to ask Anjali a question or speak from their own experience. Let's start with this woman up front here.
Thank you so much. I'm just wondering, do you have any experience with people being resistant to you and your work, and how do you resolve that? What do you do to, I guess, try and improve relationships around you?
Sure. Can you specify with respect to the people that I am making films with, or is this with respect to people that see the films?
or won't fund the films.
Those people who are involved with the storytelling process, those people who can't necessarily tell the stories themselves, and so you've included them as part of your process, or they've been included in the films, have they ever been resistant to what's happened or how they've been portrayed, or like how do you resolve that if there is any kind of conflict that arises from people not being happy or not being pleased with the work?
Yeah. I think as filmmakers, sometimes we try to be quite independent. We're like, we can't show people films beforehand, but in every case of the films that I've made, I've shown it first to the central characters, because I think that's important. It is a collaboration, and my first question when I show them those films is, did I make any mistakes? Like, what could I have done better? How is this your vision? And what have I misrepresented? And I think I always have to be open to the idea that that could happen. With this particular film, Silas, I mean, we've had this conversation for a while, but he, it's quite a political film. I not only worried that I could misrepresent something, but also that there could be potential security impacts for him and his family. So of course we had to show him the film. And his response, because he's an incredible activist, was that this was bigger than him, it was bigger than the presidency, it was bigger than everything that was going on. And he felt like it was a really important story to tell, and that it just added to the platforms of the work that he and communities have been doing for a really long time. And it was a great platform for him. So I think I should just be open to the idea that people could find faults and find problems in everything that I do, and just be open to trying to fix those when possible.
Okay, let's get some hands up over here, if we can get a microphone over here.
Thanks. I thought it was a really interesting talk. Thank you. I'm interested in collaboration from the perspective of documentary filmmaking, working with patients to make sure what their voice is told to the people who have the power to change things in the healthcare environment. Two things. One, I thought was really interesting, the quote you said about nothing about us without us. I don't know where it originates from, but I know for about the last 10 years it's been used in the UK for patient advocate groups and in patient engagement. So it's funny it's coming up in your work as well. I was really interested in that app you've created, and I wondered if that was available for others to use as well.
Sure, yeah. The app is called Timby. It's timby.org. You can check it out. It's actually came out of the film itself. It was a collaboration between all of us that were working on the film. And first it started as, okay, should we be, is there a way that we can get information from these different communities and show their perspectives and so on? And very quickly, my collaborator on the project, Silas, this incredible Liberian activist, told me, unless this is useful for people, they're not going to use it. So you got to make it useful for them first, and then if there's a knockoff effect, that's wonderful for your film. So that's what we did, and now we're in over 15 countries. We are using it in the medical field for service delivery in Kenya at the moment, and there's a few other kind of projects that are popping up. And definitely one of the things that working in the medical field, you have to worry about patient confidentiality, and you have to make sure that when you're recording somebody that they give you consent, and there's a whole bunch of like ethics applications and so on that you have to go through, so it's a little more complicated, and I don't know how it would be in very different contexts and countries. So, but I'm happy to chat through it with you.
All right, you're good? All right, who's got a question? So the hand up in the back there, if we can get her a microphone.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. My question is more regarding the pipeline as to when you're first interested in a project such as this, how you came about to actually consult with individuals. Can you speak a little further to the details of how you engage those people, especially the locals and the activists?
Sure. My background is as an environmental scientist, and I was actually working for Nature magazine at the time, a science magazine. And I interviewed Silas, the main character, for a story that I was doing about Liberian forestry or something like that. And I'd called him on the phone from Kenya to Liberia, And it was a terrible connection. I was like walking through laundry in somebody's yard trying to get a better connection, and I just knew that he had an incredible story to tell. So from that point on, I think the first thing, I was working as a foreign correspondent and doing journalism, so the first time that I actually went to Liberia, I used it. I took a work trip there and filmed a totally unrelated story, but with the purpose of kind of just like meeting him and understanding. It was a long time. Like when you are making a film about a country that you don't necessarily have a massive background in, it's important to do as much research and stuff beforehand as you can. I think I read every single page of the ICC, the criminal court records on Charles Taylor and the entire back history. I read so many books, but that doesn't compare at all to just being there and being with people and understanding what the story is and allowing that story to change over time. So I think it's just, if you can, spend as much time as possible with the people that you're working with, you're collaborating with on the story that you're there, if that's feasible, and use that as a point to start a relationship for a film. And I think kind of dissolving the line between the person that's filming and the people who are being filmed. I know sometimes in documentary we feel that is a difficult line to kind of break over, that we have to be objective, that it has to be, but I think increasingly in storytelling, when we have all these different perspectives, it's really, really important to get everybody's understanding of things on board with the project.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions. I see a hand up here on the aisle. Get you a microphone coming to you.
Is the film for them in Liberia or for us? What's going to be the impact in Liberia of the film, or has it already sort of shown there? What's your hope for the film there, and what's our part in that? What do you think our part in that is?
Sure. I think it's for both. I think it's a really good question, and whenever you're making a film, you have to think about your audience, like who's going to watch this film. On one level, I think getting the story of what's happening in these communities out to the world was an important part of the story, and it's actually built into the story itself, because it's shattering kind of perceptions that we've all created about whether it's African leaders or how the world works or what influence we have, and thinking beyond the narratives that are kind of presented to us. It also makes us think more globally about the power of political families and influence, and how that, our neighbors to the south probably resonates quite strongly with them. Absolutely, it is a story, though, that must go back to Liberia. We haven't shown it there because there's an election on October 10th. And that's a general election. And as much as we believe that we've done our research and we've tried to understand the process as much as possible, the nuance of how a film like this could be used by many different sides going for that election is something that we didn't feel comfortable with. And so as a second step, when the election is over, and when things are kind of under control in the country, probably 2 rounds of elections, that's when it will be seen in the country. It has been seen by our main characters, and we've done group screenings, but it won't be until after all of the election processes has been done. I think for the entire community, it will be used freely, screening within the communities, outside of the communities, and we'll just package and give the film a life of its own in community screenings as soon as the elections are done. So that's definitely on the table.
So Anjali, remind us, when is the next screening at Tiff?
Yeah, it's tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Already.
Do you know what time?
11:30. It's at the
In the
Tiff.
morning.
Yeah, 11:30. Tiff Lightbox.
And you'll be there with your co-director, Hawa Essaman, and also
Silas, the incredible Liberian activist. He's there as well. And
so
he's the real one that you want to listen to.
It's really not an opportunity to be missed at 11:30 tomorrow. That's going to wrap this portion. We've got one more terrific conversation to come with Denis Cote, which will happen very soon after as just we reset the stage. But I want to deeply thank Anjali Nayar for joining us today.
Thank you, guys. Cheers.